The air in Studio 6B was artificially chilled. The crisp 68 degrees designed to keep the performers alert and the audience from drifting. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his polished oak desk, the wood grain shimmering under the intense overhead arrays. He looked down at his blue cards, his expression uncharacteristically somber. To his right, Representative Adam Schiff sat in the guest chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a politician's practiced posture of relaxed readiness.
And he has done so.
The applause from the audience was dying down,
which is
but the usual upbeat transition music from the Roots had been replaced by a low rhythmic bass line that hummed in the floorboards. Fallon didn't start with a joke. He didn't ask about the upcoming elections or the latest legislative gridlock. Instead, he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a translucent manila folder. The plastic reflected the studio lights, casting a sharp glare toward the cameras. Schiff's eyes tracked the movement, a slight tightening appearing at the corners of his mouth. We've spent a lot of time talking about transparency over the last decade. Adam, Jimmy began, his voice dropping into a register that felt more like a boardroom than a variety show. He didn't look at the guest yet. He looked at the folder. He spoke about the public trust and the way certain names seem to appear and disappear from history like ink in the rain. He mentioned the Southern District of New York. He mentioned a vault that had been sealed since 2019, one that the public was told contained nothing but redundant digital backups. Schiff nodded slowly, his face a mask of professional concern. He began to speak about the importance of the rule of law, his voice steady, using the cadence of a man who had delivered 1,000 speeches. He spoke about procedural integrity and the need to protect the privacy of those not charged with crimes. But Jimmy interrupted him, not with a shout, but with a question that felt like a physical weight. He asked the representative about a specific tail number, a Gulfstream private jet that had been scrubbed from the official FAA records in early 2017. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. Jimmy opened the folder and slid a high-resolution photograph across the desk. It wasn't a picture of a person. It was a picture of a logbook entry, handwritten in cramped, precise script. The ink was faded, but the names were legible. Jimmy pointed to a line dated June 14, 2012. He asked why the representative's personal security detail had logged a departure from Teterboro that the representative himself had denied under oath during the 2021 closed-door sessions. Schiff leaned forward, the fabric of his suit jacket bunching at the shoulders. He didn't look at the photo immediately. He looked at Jimmy, searching for the punchline that usually came. But Jimmy wasn't smiling. The host was leaning back, his hands flat on the desk, his eyes fixed on the guest, with a terrifyingly calm intensity. Schiff began to explain that records from that era were notoriously unreliable, that travel manifests were often handled by junior staffers who made clerical errors. He spoke about the fog of a busy legislative schedule. Jimmy listened, nodding occasionally, letting the silence between Schiff's sentences grow longer and more uncomfortable. When the representative finished his explanation, Jimmy pulled a second item from the folder. It was a small, red-bound notebook. It looked old, the leather edges frayed and darkened by sweat and oil. The audience, which usually provided a constant low-level murmur of laughter or affirmation, was deathly silent. The sound of a single cough echoed from the back of the studio like a gunshot. "This was recovered from the Palm Beach residence 3 months ago," Jimmy said quietly. "It wasn't in the initial inventory. It was behind a false wall in the library, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of a law ledger." Jimmy didn't open it. He just let it sit there, a small red block of evidence between them. He told the representative that the notebook contained not just names, but specific coordinates, times of arrival, and notes on donations that never appeared on any FEC filing. The color began to drain from Schiff's face. It wasn't a sudden shock, but a gradual, agonizing retreat of blood. He reached for the glass of water on the side table, his fingers brushing against the rim. He took a sip, but his throat seemed to seize, and he had to swallow hard before he could speak again. He tried to pivot. He tried to talk about the political motivations of the special committee that had leaked these documents to the press. He tried to frame the entire conversation as a coordinated attack on his character. Jimmy didn't take the bait. He didn't defend the committee or the leak. He simply asked about the note on page 42. He read it aloud. It was a short sentence, a directive regarding the scrubbing of a flight to a private island in the Caribbean. The note was initialed. The initials matched the man sitting 3 feet away from him. The camera zoomed in, capturing the micro-tremor in Schiff's left eyelid. The interrogation wasn't loud. It was surgical. Jimmy asked about the phone calls. He asked about the encrypted messages sent through a third-party server in Zurich. He asked why, if everything was a clerical error, the representative had spent $60,000 of his own money on a digital forensics firm to wipe his private cloud storage 48 hours after the notebook was found. Schiff's posture began to fail. His shoulders slumped, and he looked away from Jimmy, staring instead at the red notebook as if it were a ticking device. He started a sentence, stopped, and started again. He spoke about the complexity of international travel and the need for confidentiality in high-level diplomatic circles. His voice had lost its resonance. It was thin, reedy, and lacked the conviction that had sustained his career for decades. Jimmy reached out and touched the red notebook, his finger tracing the frayed spine. He told the representative that the show wasn't going to commercial. He told him that they had 20 minutes of airtime left and that the cameras would stay on until the end. He said that the American people weren't interested in procedural excuses anymore. They wanted to know why the names in the notebook matched the names on the unscrubbed flight logs. The silence that followed lasted for nearly 30 seconds. In the world of television, 30 seconds of silence is an eternity. It is a vacuum that sucks the life out of a performance. Schiff sat there, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting between the camera and the host. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that the floor beneath him was nothing but a thin layer of ice, and that the ice had just shattered. Jimmy didn't move. He didn't prompt him. He waited. The lights above them hummed, a low-frequency buzz that seemed to grow louder as the silence deepened. The shadows in the studio seemed to lengthen, casting the guest in a harsh, unforgiving light. The audience was a sea of dark shapes, hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting for the collapse. Schiff tried one last time. He mentioned his service to the country. He mentioned the years he had spent in the halls of power, fighting for the Constitution. But even as he spoke the words, they felt hollow. They were the echoes of a dead era. Jimmy interrupted him softly. He asked if the Constitution protected the scrubbing of logs involving the exploitation of miners. He asked if service to the country included the systematic destruction of evidence held in a New York vault. The representative's hands began to shake visibly. He tucked them under his thighs, but the movement only made the collapse more obvious. He looked at the exit, then back at Jimmy. The host's face was a mask of cold disappointment. There were no jokes left. There was no more late-night charm. There was only the red notebook and the weight of 1,000 secrets that were no longer secret. Jimmy picked up the manila folder and tucked the photograph back inside. He left the red notebook on the desk. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and looked directly into the lens of camera 1. He didn't say goodbye to the guest. He didn't thank him for coming. He simply told the viewers that the truth has a way of finding the light, even when it's buried in the dark corners of the most powerful offices in the world. As the screen faded to black, the last thing the audience saw was Adam Schiff, frozen in the guest chair, his face a pale ghost of the man who had walked onto the stage 20 minutes earlier. The red notebook remained on the oak desk, a small, silent monument to the end of a career. The studio remained silent long after the on-air light went dark. The only sound was the hum of the cooling cameras and the distant, muffled sound of the city outside. A world that was about to change forever. The narrative of the scrubbed logs and the secret vault would dominate the news cycle for months to come. But the moment of the collapse, the exact second the room ceased to be safe, would be remembered as the night the late-night stage became a courtroom. The documents had been turned. The logs had been read. The silence had said everything. The representative stayed in the chair for 5 minutes after the crew began to break down the set. He didn't speak to his aides. He didn't look at his phone. He simply stared at the spot on the desk where the notebook had been. He knew that the recordings of this night would be played in every courtroom and every living room in the country. He knew that the procedural shields had been pierced, and that the narrative he had carefully constructed for years had evaporated under the heat of the studio lights. Jimmy Fallon walked back to his dressing room without a word to anyone. He had done what the investigators couldn't. He had used the medium of the people to bring the truth to the people. The Epstein ledger was no longer a conspiracy theory or a rumor discussed in the dark corners of the internet. It was a physical reality, a red-bound witness to a history that many had tried to erase. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. The digital forensics firm was subpoenaed. The special committee received the full unscrubbed logs. The Swiss servers were seized. But nothing was as impactful as those 20 minutes in Studio 6B. The image of the frozen politician, the red book, and the calm host became the definitive visual of the era. It was the moment the public realized that no vault was deep enough and no office was high enough to hide the truth once it decided to be told. The transition from late-night entertainment to historical record was complete. The show was no longer just about celebrities and games. It had become the final stage for the powerful to face the reality of their choices. And as the investigation expanded into the highest reaches of the federal government, everyone looked back at that one night in December, the night the logs were revealed, as the beginning of the end. The weight of the evidence continued to mount. Every name mentioned in the notebook was scrutinized. Every date on the logs was cross-referenced with official calendars. The web of contradictions that Jimmy Fallon had gently pulled on during the interview began to unravel the entire structure of the political establishment. It was a domino effect that started with a single manila folder and ended with the total restructuring of federal accountability. Through it all, the video of the confrontation remained the most watched piece of media in history. It was studied by psychologists for its depiction of frozen fear. It was analyzed by legal scholars for its use of evidence. But for the average viewer, it was simply the moment of the collapse. It was the moment they saw a powerful man realize that he was no longer in control. It was the moment the truth became unavoidable. The studio light finally dimmed to a single blue glow. The oak desk was wiped down by the cleaning crew. The fingerprints of the confrontation polished away, but the memory of the red notebook and the silence of Adam Schiff remained etched into the cultural consciousness. The Epstein files were no longer a mystery. They were a matter of public record, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. The accountability narrative had reached its zenith. The era of the unscrubbed history had begun, and as the cameras prepared for the next guest, the next story, and the next revelation, the ghost of that night continued to haunt the halls of Washington. The room was no longer safe for secrets. The truth had found its voice, and it wouldn't be silenced again. As the credits would eventually roll on this chapter of history, the focus would remain on that singular interaction. The calm host, the collapsing guest, the red book. It was the perfect synthesis of narrative inevitability and psychological escalation. It was the moment the game ended, and the reckoning began. The lights were up, the logs were out, and the logs didn't lie. The final frame of the video would always be the same, a close-up of the red notebook, its frayed edges, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of the television studio. It was a reminder that no matter how much power one accumulates, the smallest piece of evidence can bring the largest empire to its knees. The truth was out, and it was never going back in the vault. The investigation would continue, but the narrative was already written. The collapse was complete. The silence was final. The logs were revealed, and for Adam Schiff, it was truly over.